Welcome to the one-year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. 2 Nephi, chapter 5. Chapter overview. Nephi continues preaching at his wicked brethren, and they rebel and attempt to kill him. So he and the good people, quote, flee into the wilderness and, quote, journeyed for the space of many days. Then settle down and make swords and build buildings, including a temple. But the Lamanites, that is, everyone else, whether they were actually descended from Laman or not, were cursed and became dark-skinned. Nephi makes Jacob and Joseph priests and teachers, and the Nephites live happily, and at some point after that, it has now been 30 years since they left Jerusalem. Then Nephi makes more plates and engraves on them. Then 40 years passed, apparently including the 30 years. So we're talking 40 years total since Lehi left Jerusalem in 1 Nephi 1. And during this time there were wars with the Lamanites. There is a lot that happens in this chapter, so let's get down to it. First, I can't be the only one who sees Nephi as completely arrogant and overbearing. So it's really hard for me to blame the Lamanites for not liking him. Sure, they should have been good anyway, but I found myself wanting to punch Nephi, so I don't really blame them for wanting to kill him. But his brothers do, verse 4, though we're not exactly told how. So God tells him to flee into the wilderness. By contrast, when the biblical Jacob flees from his brother Esau, he goes with only his staff. Apparently, Nephi has time not only to gather up a whole big group of people, but also everything they could possibly carry, including their tents and the brass plates and the compass ball thingy. So I guess the brothers' desire to kill him was more of a protracted desire rather than an outright attempt to murder him. These Lamanites also apparently don't care enough about killing Nephi to keep him from leaving with at least half of the people. And that also would be a reasonable explanation for why the Lamanites don't follow the Nephites to finish killing him. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Why would Nephi go just a few days into the wilderness and then set up camp and start settling? It just doesn't make sense. The Lamanites could come upon them at any time. So I guess they just wanted him to stop nagging them. And as long as he left, they were fine with his going. However, it does say that eventually that Nephi made swords like Laban, his uncle Laban's sword, made swords just like his for fear of the Lamanites. So I guess he really did think they would follow after him. So you think they wouldn't have just set up camp real close. So it doesn't really make sense altogether when you think of it. In verse 6, we're given a list of all who go with Nephi, and they are hereafter going to be called Nephites, regardless of whether they were actual descendants of Nephi or not. The other people listed include the former slave Zoram, Nephi's brothers Sam, Jacob, and Joseph, Nephi's sisters, which is the first and only time that they're ever mentioned, plus all of the families of those people, and all those who would go with me. So Mormons might claim that this included some of the good descendants of Laman, Lemuel, or the sons of Ishmael. Going back to the sisters, I think that this is an error, a slip of the tongue made by Joseph Smith, who was used to talking about brothers and sisters, and accidentally said and sisters at this time. Or it could reasonably be claimed that this was just female relatives, not Nephi's actual sisters. Otherwise, it makes no sense in the narrative because Lehi's family is enumerated in the early part of 1 Nephi, and there is no hint of any female children. Much less, we're never told who they could possibly have married, other than their own nephews. The next several verses of the narrative record that the Nephites went away from the Lamanites, quote, for the space of many days, before they settled down and pitched their tents and started planting and reaping crops and raising flocks and herds. We also read that they, quote, did observe to keep the judgments and the statutes and the commandments of the Lord in all things according to the law of Moses. Except the law requires them to have priests descended from Aaron and Levi and to offer sacrifices only at the temple. And this they cannot do. Verse 13 records, and it came to pass that we began to prosper exceedingly and to multiply in the land. Then the next verse says, and I, Nephi, did take the sword of Laban, and after the manner of it did make many swords. Again, he said he did this because he was afraid of the Lamanites. So why would they settle down so close? But anyway, The reason I'm emphasizing this verse is that I've had a Mormon try to get around the lack of metal remains from the Book of Mormon peoples, things like sword, armor, and such like, by saying that swords wouldn't necessarily have to be metal, but could be made of wood. And he even included some link that talked about ancient wooden swords. However, Laban's sword is identified in 1 Nephi as being made of the most precious steel with a hilt of pure gold. So if Nephi makes many swords like Laban's, and we're also told that they've got abundant ore, then that would mean that they must have been metal as well. And especially in line of the following verse, which talks about Nephi teaching his people to work in metal and specifying steel, and there being abundant ore. So there is no reason on earth for there not to be any metal implements or metal remains of the Book of Mormon peoples. Verse 16 is a major verse, and it requires much discussion. It says, "And I, Nephi, did build a temple, and I did construct it after the manner of the temple of Solomon, save it were not built of so many precious things. For they were not to be found upon the land. Wherefore it could not be built like unto Solomon's temple. But the manner of the construction was like unto the temple of Solomon, and the workmanship thereof was exceedingly fine." First, the law of Moses allows for only one legitimate meeting place, either the tabernacle while the Israelites were mobile, or the temple after the time of Solomon, but not both at the same time, and no more than one. So for a second temple to be built is a clear violation of the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 12, for instance, instructs the Israelites to tear down all the multiple altars and groves and such like dedicated to the false gods, and to build one place for worship in the place that God would choose, and all the sacrifices and burnt offerings were required to be offered there. Yet Nephi claims that they followed the law. Now we need to turn our attention to the actual building of this temple in the Americas. And we will start by looking at the building of Solomon's temple in the Bible, found in 1 Kings 6 and following, and 2 Chronicles 3 and following. The materials of the temple were listed as follows. It was made of stone, various types of wood, cedar, olive, and fir are mentioned specifically, gold, brass, silver, precious stones, and the fabric veil, made of blue, purple, crimson, and fine linen, which divided the holy place from the holiest of holies. It also took 7 years to build, and 180,000 common laborers, plus 3,300 officers or overseers. Let's look at 2 Nephi 5:15. "And I did teach my people that they should build buildings, and that they should work in all manner of wood, and of iron, and copper, and of brass, and of steel, and of gold, and of silver, and of precious ores, which were in great abundance." So what precious things that were used in Solomon's temple were not to be found upon the land of the Americas? The Nephites had all manner of wood and precious ores in great abundance. And of course, the Americans aren't exactly lacking in stone. This leaves only precious stones, and I will admit it might be plausible to say that they would be more difficult to find, especially in North America. But fabrics that could be dyed blue, purple, or crimson is implausible that they couldn't find or make. So it makes no sense, especially since the only thing possibly lacking was gemstones. I need to reiterate that Nephi here says that the temple that they built was not like Solomon's temple only because they were lacking the materials to build the temple, not because they were only, say, a couple dozen people trying to build a temple that took 7 years and 180,000 people to build in the old world. Verse 18 says, "And it came to pass that they would that I should be their king, but I, Nephi, was desirous that they should have no king." This reminds me of the opinion of an American of the early 1800s who would be proud not to have a king, and even prouder that they had defeated the British king and kingship. But putting this in the context of the time of the Book of Mormon, one would expect Nephi to have rejected the kingship on the grounds that only God was to be king over the Israelites, such as 1 Samuel 10:19, or that only a descendant of David could be king over the Jews, as in 2 Chronicles 13:5, 2 Chronicles 21:7, and many other places. Oddly, however, in 1 Nephi 10:1, Nephi says that the records include an account of his reign. So which is it? Did Nephi reign, like he claimed in 1 Nephi, or did he refuse to reign, like he claims in 2 Nephi? The next several verses discuss the Lamanites and them being cut off from the presence of the Lord, and had a sore cursing because of their iniquity to come upon them. What is this cursing? According to verse 21, they originally were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, but then the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. I've actually had LDSs say that this skin of blackness and being white and delightsome actually had nothing to do with actual skin color, but were merely metaphorical statements that showed their spiritual condition. Not only is that laughable on its face, but verse 21 actually requires that it be something outward, because this was said to be something that God caused to come upon the Lamanites, quote, that they might not be enticing unto my people, and, quote, that they shall be loathsome, verse 22. Verse 23 continues, and cursed shall be the seed of him that mixes with their seed, for they shall be cursed even with the same cursing. Well, now we know where Brigham Young got the basis of his similar injunction and curse in his February 1852 speech before the Utah Territorial Legislature against anyone, especially Mormons, who would mix their seed with the Africans. I will have the link to this full speech in the description, but I'm only going to read part of it. Let this church, which is called the kingdom of God on the earth, we will summons the first presidency, the 12, the high council, the bishopric, and all the elders of Israel. Suppose we summons them to appear here, and here declare that it is right to mingle our seed with the black race of Cain, that they shall come in with us and be partakers with us of all the blessings God has given to us. On that very day and hour we should do so. The priesthood is taken from this church and kingdom, and God leaves us to our fate. The moment we consent to mingle with the seed of Cain, the church must go to destruction. We should receive the curse which has been placed upon the seed of Cain, and never more be numbered with the children of Adam, who are heirs to the priesthood, until that curse be removed. The description of these wicked Lamanites continues in verse 24 and 25. Quote, an idle people, full of mischief and subtlety, and did seek in the wilderness for beasts of prey. Remember that the original Mormons claimed that the Lamanites were the ancestors of the American Indians, so this description is of them. Verse 26 says that Nephi, quote, did consecrate Jacob and Joseph that they should be priests and teachers over the land of my people. First, this is an extreme violation of the law of Moses, which allows only descendants of Levi, and specifically of Aaron, to be a priest. Secondly, we find out in verse 28 that at or after this consecration, quote, 30 years had passed away from the time we left Jerusalem. This is the first real time stamp of the Book of Mormon since 1 Nephi's statement that Lehi and family were in the wilderness for 8 years. Since Jacob and Joseph were born at some point after Lehi left Jerusalem during the 8 years of sojourn in the wilderness prior to entering the land called Bountiful, they must have been somewhat less than 30 years old at the time they were consecrated. According to the law of Moses, priests had to be at least 30 years old in order to serve as priests. But if Mormons don't mind that non-Levites would be consecrated as priests to start with, why should they care that they're also too young? How old were Jacob and Joseph? Well, we can't really say. If this chapter is read as a chronology, which would be the natural reading, especially in light of the chronological nature of 1st and 2nd Nephi, first, the temple would be completed in verse 16. Then Nephi's people were industrious in verse 17. The Lamanites were cursed in verse 21. Then Jacob and Joseph were made priests in verse 26. The people lived happily in the land for some unspecified amount of time, verse 27. And finally, 30 years had passed away from the time Lehi left Jerusalem at the beginning of 1st Nephi, verse 28. If this is a chronological statement, the temple was completed for some time before they were even priests. And that would be even more problematic, not only because Jacob and Joseph would be far too young to be priests, but also because then because then the temple would have been completed for a time without there being any priests at all. It is possible, I will admit, to read this as more of a summary statement, so that the temple being completed and Jacob and Joseph being made priests would take place not far apart from each other, and also that this not be too far before the end of the 30 years. Now, let's look at the population of the Book of Mormon peoples at the end of 30 years. This may or may not be around the same time that they would be completing the temple. It just depends on where that falls in this chronology. Remember that at the beginning of 1st Nephi, we have the population consisting entirely and solely of Lehi and Sariah, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi, the former slave Zoram, and then Ishmael's family joins them, which consists of Ishmael and his wife, 2 sons and 5 daughters, and the wives of his 2 sons, plus possibly some other children, because it speaks of Ishmael's sons' families. And that's it. Then Ishmael dies at some point in the wilderness, so that means there's 17 adults and an unnumbered group of children that left the wilderness, built the boat, and came to the Americas. Further, while Ishmael's sons may have had children at the start of the wilderness sojourn, the 4 sons of Lehi and Zoram married Ishmael's 5 daughters after they left Jerusalem. So the first children born from those unions, as well as Lehi's sons Jacob and Joseph, would have to be somewhat younger than 30 at the end of the 30 years mentioned in this chapter. Not to mention any other children born even later, say on the ship or at the Americas to start with. Even assuming Jacob and Joseph were born as twins in year 1, and assuming the temple was built at the end of year 30, and assuming that they got married and started having children as young as 15, Jacob and Joseph's oldest children could have been no more than 13 to 15 at the time of building the temple, and more likely the children would have been no older than 10 at the most. But if Jacob and Joseph were born some years after year 1, and or the temple was built many years before year 30, then that greatly reduces the maximum number of adults available to build the temple. Of the older set of people, that is the 4 older sons of Lehi, Zoram, then the 2 sons of Ishmael, they could possibly have had as many as 5 children per couple prior to getting to the Americas. 2 to 3 would be a much more reasonable number. But if the women happened to have a child every year, which is extremely unlikely, and none died in infancy, again unlikely, and or if there were twins or triplets among them, again unlikely, it's possible that there could have been as many as 8 children apiece. And this could give possibly 35 people or so in their 20s by the end of year 30. But the people were split into Nephites and Lamanites, so the Nephites would be probably no more than, say, 25 to 30 adults aged 20 and up, and this includes both men and women, by the end of 30 years. And if the building of the temple was sometime earlier, then that would put the adult population of the Nephites as even lower. Even if there's like, say, 40 teenagers or 50 that are aged 13 and up, they really built a temple just like Solomon's, except not so fine because they didn't have access to the materials. By the end of 30 years with 40 or even 50 people, when the original took 7 years and 180,000 people to build. Yep. Right. Verse 32 sounds like a logical fallacy to me, sort of like a reverse of No True Scotsman. And if my people are pleased with the things of God, they will be pleased with mine engravings which are upon these plates. It sounds like it's saying, you say you like the things of God. Well, these things are also the things of God. So if you really do like the things of God like you say, you must also like what I write, because they're also the things of God. And if you don't like the things that are on these plates, well, then you must not like the things of God at all. Verse 34 says, And it sufficeth me to say that 40 years had passed away, and we had already had wars and contentions with our brethren. This is a weird way of putting it and having such an appendix. Plus, it's ambiguous as to whether the 40 years is subsequent to the 30 years or if the 30 years is part of the 40 years. For what it's worth, the unanimous opinion of the Mormon group I polled was the latter, that at this point it was 40 years total since Lehi's leaving Jerusalem. But then the question becomes, who is fighting? There's only like 50 adults on each side, maybe 25 men, and if they fight, they die, and that reduces their numbers even more, as well as greatly limits any possible population expansion.